your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. Thanks so much for joining us for a look at what made headlines in Alberta this past week. The Alberta government will be providing $149 million in financial help to help Jasper recover and rebuild following a devastating wildfire this summer that wiped out a third of the town. Officials say the funding will be provided through the province's disaster recovery program. It provides financial help for uninsurable losses or damage resulting from a disaster. In a statement, Public Safety and Emergency Services Minister Mike Ellis said, quote, "We are committed to providing the necessary support for recovery in Jasper and all Alberta communities affected by wildfire this year. This funding will cover critical areas of need, from uninsurable infrastructure damage to emergency operations costs, ensuring communities can recover swiftly and safely." Government officials say eligible expenses are shared with the province, kicking in 90% of total costs. The municipal share of 10% is deducted from their payment, so no out-of-pocket costs will be incurred. The city of Calgary officially voted to dissolve the Green Line LRT project on Tuesday. However, closing the initiative will now cost the city an extra $850 million on top of the expenditure costs from building the project. In total, the city will owe $2.1 billion. The city will aim to transfer the costs and liability to the province after the province decided to withhold funding when cost overruns of the first phase of only 9 kilometers budgeted to over $6 billion. Transportation Minister Devin Dreeshen was the one who sent the letter of intent to City Council to pull the funding. He says the current alignment put forward by Calgary City Council was an irresponsible waste of taxpayer money.
We gave 3 conditions to Calgary Council on a green line that would actually work for the city. And it was tying into the red and blue line downtown, going to the new event center, which essentially will be the new Saddle Dome, and then stretching as far to the southeast into the suburbs as possible, and hopefully to the community of Shepherd and beyond. But unfortunately, the city came back with an alignment that only met 2 out of those 3 conditions. And so that's why we set our $1.53 billion of provincial money into the Green Line. It's not going to go with that alignment. And we have now contracted out an engineering firm that will actually have a new alignment that we will share with the city in December that actually does stretch out to the southeast part of Calgary and just ultimately serve more Calgarians on this new Green Line.
In other news, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith announced $8.6 billion will be going towards building new schools to help face capacity problems over the next 7 years. Even with the Alberta is Calling campaign, Smith says her government was surprised at the number of people who moved to the province last year. She says schools are being squeezed by the huge influx. Alberta's population increased by more than 200,000 from 2023 to this year. The Alberta Teachers Association, meanwhile, says it's been advocating for years on school capacity, and although new schools are a good measure, this funding fails to address the staffing issues within these new schools.
When I talk to my colleagues across the province, they're, people who've been teaching 10, 20 years, they've never seen class sizes as large as they're seeing right now. They're seeing students come with really complex needs, and they don't have educational assistance support for them. So for instance, I talked to a colleague of mine who has students who are in grade 1 who aren't toilet trained yet, and they don't have an assistant. We have colleagues who are doing literacy and numeracy tests right now. In 1 to 3, they're losing up to 90 hours of instructional time doing these tests. We have colleagues who are talking about the fact that they don't have supports for special needs students. They don't have Chromebooks. They don't have resources for the new curriculum.
Now, during Premier Smith's press conference on Wednesday, she did address a question regarding extra funding to hire more teachers.
The funding model was working for us when we had declining enrollment, declining population, and it works for declining school boards because it's a 3-year weighted average, and it's to protect school boards so that they don't end up with a dramatic reduction. With this huge surge, it's not as responsive as we need it to be for enrollment growth. So the minister is going through the Treasury Board process and working on an alternative model. 125 million we announced a few weeks ago to be able to help with this school year, but there'll be more to say in the upcoming budget, which will be delivered in February.
We have more details on the state of education in the province coming up after the break. As previously mentioned, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith announced $8.6 billion aimed at building more schools and creating around 200,000 new spaces for students over the next 7 years. To chat about this huge initiative in more detail is our legislative reporter and Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joined BCN's Hal Roberts from Edmonton. Dawson says this is one of the largest infrastructure plans in Alberta history, and the plan will apparently be financed by taking on loans.
So that's maybe the part that people might be less enthused about, let's say. I don't think anyone is particularly opposed to building more schools. I think it's fairly obvious at this point that schools are pretty overcrowded. And also this is not, a particularly new problem. I remember more than 30 students per class when I was in elementary school 30 years ago. So this is not a particularly new problem, but this is the latest crack at solving it, shall we say. Now that 8.6 billion it's going to be over 7 years, so it's not like this expenditure is sort of all going to come at one point, but it does seem to be financed by loans. And the other thing that's going to happen here, which is actually a bit of a change from the way the province normally builds schools, is that the province is going to retain ownership of the schools and lease them to school boards instead of dispersing grants to school boards to build schools. The benefit of this seems to be that you could approve and build projects sort of over the course of the year without requiring, annual budget writing, annual budget season being the time when this money goes out. So it might sort of make this process flow a little more easily over the course of a given year. Not going to be happening super soon. Obviously there are all sorts of things that need to happen before a school can be built. Land needs to be found, plans need to be drawn up, all that kind of stuff. And so school boards are supposed to be looking into that in the next little bit. But, a massive, massive expenditure, and the Premier took to television last night to lay that out before Albertans. I don't know, a Premier's address to the province isn't usually used for something like a spending announcement. So it was a bit of an interesting twist on the subjects that are normally brought up during those sorts of things. But anyways, massive spending, clearly a huge overhaul in parts of the education system, and I guess we'll see how it turns out.
Tyler, the UCP will be holding its annual convention on November the 1st and 2nd, I believe. Now, you actually got your hands on an early version of potential policy resolutions that may be discussed. What really jumped out for you?
Well, a few things really jumped out. This is the sort of unedited list, shall we say. It was really, really long, like maybe 50 or 60 different resolutions. And what happened was they all went out to the party's members 2 weeks ago, and members had 2 weeks to rank what they thought were the most important, their top priorities. And then the party sort of takes the top ranked ones and they end up for public debate at the convention in a month and a half here. So it's a bit of a Wild West as a result. And the ones that jumped out at me were, the big one actually that really jumped out at me was the suggestion that Alberta should get strong mayor legislation like Ontario. As it is in every city and town in Alberta, the mayor is just sort of one vote on the council. Of course, they have a little bit of authority but it's really the bully pulpit. Their vote counts for no more than any other councillor. Strong mayor legislation would change that to some extent. It would give the mayor some veto powers, for example. It could give the mayors more direct budget making power as opposed to a committee writing budgets, things like that. So that one, if that's adopted, that could have some pretty significant changes or effects, I should say, on the way that municipal government works in the province. And then there were some other sort of social issues, shall we say, that caught my eye. Because what's always interesting, I think, with conservative parties is the extent that social conservatives, successfully bring their issues up and have them incorporated into policy. If we look at the Stephen Harper years, that's the perfect example of social conservatives not really getting very far, despite working pretty hard at it. And times have maybe shifted a little bit. So there are some new policies around female-only spaces, for example, in bathrooms and change rooms, things like that. These are not wildly different from policy that's already been adopted. There was one resolution that would seek to not fund third trimester abortions, which are very rare as it is in Alberta. But you can imagine that the NDP will be quite worked up about that. And the same thing with private healthcare. There's a resolution that says that Albertans should be able to seek private surgical procedures if there's too many delays in the public system. Again, this is the sort of thing the NDP loves to fight about, even if it's maybe not that controversial of a proposal for a lot of people. So it's really interesting just seeing where the constituency associations around the province started. What things did they think were the most important issues facing Alberta? And then we'll see in a couple weeks here when the final list comes out, what did the party's membership overall think was important? And that will lead to the debate at the convention. So it's a bit of a how the sausage is made kind of process, but pretty interesting nonetheless.
Coming up, if you have school-aged children, you may have heard of grade inflation. But according to our next guest, it doesn't always benefit the student. We explain after the break. Do parents need to check on their children and the level of education that students might be attaining? Well, have you heard of grade inflation? Our next guest, Kaylin Ford, tells Leaders on the Frontier, David Lease, that with the pressure teachers are under, their students may not be positioned for their best, but rather just moved through the grades, regardless of the child's skill level. Take a look.
So as we think about the role of parents, that obviously you've articulated as being primary in terms of education. What about the roles of teachers then? Like, do you have advice in terms of how to relate to your teacher?
How to relate to your teacher as a parent, you mean,
As a parent, yes. Pardon me, I should have qualified that.
Yeah, well, I would hope that parents find ways to be involved with the classroom. So I know not everyone has the ability or the bandwidth to volunteer, but if you can, that's a really great thing to do. And making sure that you have open communication pathways. I sort of, I'm kind of loath to suggest that you should be on your teacher's back all the time because obviously that takes a lot away from the teacher. If they have 20 to 30 parents who are sort of constantly requiring communication, that's difficult. But I think finding ways to be involved, to know your teacher, to ask questions of your children, to communicate proactively if you think that your children are falling behind. This is kind of more practical and less philosophical, but in opening schools, we see a lot of kids applying and coming in, and their parents think that they're doing fine academically, and their report cards suggest that they're, above average students, and they're in fact several grade levels behind. So a lot of parents have no idea how bad it is in terms of their child's acquisition of foundational numeracy and literacy skills, for example.
Wait a sec. Can you clarify that? So you're saying that there's parents who are kind of passive. They think their kids are doing well. Their report cards seem to be suggesting they're doing okay, but they could be several grades behind? Seriously? Yeah. That happens today?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you see just rampant grade inflation in schools across the country because I think teachers and administrators don't want to deal with upset parents whose children are failing. I think there's increasingly sort of trendy ideas that failing children or giving them poor grades will destroy their self-confidence, and that's sort of the worst thing you could do to them. So, 50 is sort of the minimum grade you'll ever get. And so, yeah, you have a lot of parents whose kids have been passed along. Their report cards don't indicate an obvious problem. Teachers are also overburdened, right? In Alberta, for example, our population's grown substantially in the last several years, and you have a lot of teachers now with classrooms of over 30 children. That's a lot to deal with. So there are sort of systemic pressures. There are also, I think, kind of ideological or philosophical reasons why A lot of teachers don't feel supported by school administrators or school boards in giving failing grades. And so they're not incentivized to be honest with parents about where they are.
Okay, so what an absurd system. So the report card doesn't really mean anything if Johnny and Sally are all getting A's and B's.
Well, A's and B's would be great. I think in British Columbia, they've moved to a model where the report cards use sort of vague language like emerging, developing, reaching. No one knows what this means, right? And I think it's intended to sort of soften the blow, maybe for children who are not doing well. I'm not really sure. But again, it's you're sort of confounding the signals that would normally tell parents that there's something wrong with the education their child is receiving.
Okay.
Future teachers are told not to use the most effective method to teach children. They're told that it's sort of oppressive because if you're actually teaching something as a teacher, you're presuming ignorance on the part of your students, and so you're
That's right.
putting
It's
yourself in a position
oppressive.
of it's oppressive to yeah. So again, this goes back to Paulo Freire. Um, the idea that the teacher should teach and the students learn, the teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. This to him is an example of an oppressive dynamic, and you need to level these hierarchies. So you shouldn't have teachers and students, you should have student teachers and teacher students. If you ever hear teachers
My, oh
saying
my.
things like, I learn as much from my students as they do from me, these are people who have been, again, probably unwittingly influenced by this idea. So a common phrase that people use is, you should be a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage as a teacher. So you should be
Okay.
basically just sort of at the side of your students, facilitating student-led exploration, not actually leading the teaching.
In continuing our discussion about education, there is an ongoing debate over who has the final say when it comes to our children in school. More about that after the break. Parental rights in education continues to be a point of contention between school boards, teachers, politicians, parents, and students. Who ultimately has the final say when it comes to our children? Jeff Park is the president of the Alberta Parents Union. He provides BCN's Hal Roberts an update on the ongoing debate over pronoun policies, sex education, and parental rights.
So we did get an announcement from Danielle Smith on January 31st that that in Alberta we will be having parents having to consent for a child to change their name or pronouns at school up until age 16, and even for 16 and 17-year-old children, parents will have to be informed. So schools will no longer be able to have policies of keeping these things secret from parents, which was the majority, the vast majority actually, of Alberta school boards currently have such a policy. And so I shouldn't say was, it still is the case, because while the announcement happened on January 31st of this year, there have been no actual policy changes or implementation yet. Now, we've been assured that we will see all of that in law, in policy, in regulation by the time of the UCP AGM and the leadership review of Danielle Smith. And I would hazard to say that her fidelity and delivering on what she promised on these issues will probably be the deciding factor in how well she does in that leadership review on November 2nd.
Now, Jeff, parents are quite concerned over what's being taught in our schools, and not necessarily the curriculum itself, but apparently school boards and principals as well. Now, you've expressed concern that individual teachers are allegedly being allowed to bring in all sorts of extra content into the classrooms that maybe falls outside of the official curriculum. Can you explain?
It really is more at these outside materials that are brought in. And just for a few examples, we know that the Alberta Teachers Association's library has a wide range of resources for teachers that are informed by critical race theory, and they promote them all the time. We know that St. Albert Public Schools quietly introduced a 2S LGBTQIA plus course for junior high. They did consult on that course and had it developed by the newest senator from Alberta, Chris Wells, but they did not consult parents on any of this material. And there's a Canadian company called Less Plan that sells pre-built lesson plans, and some of them talk about the health and environmental benefits of eating crickets, for instance, or they'll put an ideological spin on the events at the United States Capitol building. We know that many principals require teachers to include a climate emphasis week, sometimes without informing parents, and include that in all the classrooms. We know that the Alberta Teachers Association has a recommended resource that says that the real problem, the real reason that there is a climate crisis, and the real reason that we're not going to be able to get over it until we get over the idea that there is such a thing as private property. They say private property is the real problem that's causing the climate crisis. And then finally, we know that the ATA also developed the PRISM toolkit, that's PRISM, like the thing that turns white light into a rainbow, which gives specific lesson plans to teach about human sexuality while evading the requirement to inform parents.
So, Jeff, you've made a number of claims here regarding the outside materials, and do you have substantial proof as well?
Absolutely, yes. So, so the PRISM toolkit you can look up online. There's a elementary education version and there's a high school version. The Alberta Teachers Association promotes it widely. They're very proud of it. And as far as anything else, these are all easily accessible, easily proved things that we can absolutely point to. We know are coming into the classrooms. We know are being, in many cases, encouraged to be brought into the classrooms by the Alberta Teachers Association, which does, after all, it is supposed to be the organization licensing teachers and suggesting whether a teacher should have their license pulled and all that kind of thing. So that does exert some influence into the kinds of resources that teachers use.
Up next, each year, close to 800,000 people worldwide die as a result of suicide. After the break, we hear from an expert and learn where Canada stands among that number and what mental health supports are available to those who contemplate taking their life. Welcome back. September is World Suicide Prevention Month. Suicide impacts people of all ages and backgrounds in our country. And according to Stats Canada, each year, more than 4,000 people in Canada commit suicide, which is equivalent to 12 people dying each and every day. The Mental Health Services team lead with the University of Lethbridge, Brian Bullock, explains what leads some to try and take their own life and what mental health supports are available.
It's this lack of choice or, just this stuckness potentially. But then again, not everyone goes to thoughts of suicide. There is a fair amount of supports out there. So I would say in that regard, like whether that's the hospital, going to emergency room, the crisis intervention team, or, if someone's just needing support and somewhere safe to be, that could be the crisis beds. There's private counseling options. There's community agencies as well. So there's some free or subsidized counseling options. We always make those efforts. I think those are more of those preventative efforts that are continually made, whether that's health promotion, whether that's just awareness, whether that's resilience.
According to Stats Canada, each day more than 200 people in Canada attempt suicide. The research also says the risk for suicide is higher in men and boys and people serving federal sentences. Women have higher rates of self-harm, which experts say can be a risk factor for suicide as well. Well, the shorts and t-shirt weather will soon come to an end, and parents are looking to outfit their children with the proper apparel they'll need to survive those frigid months ahead. K2 Shaw is the executive director for Every Voice Matters Society. His organization has launched a campaign called Let's Beat the Cold Together, which is accepting donations of jackets, toques, mittens, and boots for kids in the K through 12 grades.
There are a lot of kids in the community from a lot of school divisions, a lot of people who are young as well. So parents cannot afford in our cold weather, and kids go with the sweaters and all that stuff. I have my own 2 kids, so I know how it feels at -40 in a sweater.
As I've often said, anything that we can do to support our youth, which means any investment in our youth is an investment in our future, in this city's future, in this country's future. And this is certainly one of those initiatives that we are more than proud and happy to partner with Mr. Shaw and his team to hopefully bring some success to it and put some warm clothes on some of our youth's backs so they can actually have a great winter.
The provincial statistic for children under the age of 15 living in poverty is 1 in 6. And in the city of Lethbridge, that statistic is 1 in 5. And I know within our school division, we serve over 150 students annually with winter gear. And it costs approximately $200 to outfit a student with mitts, snow pants, gloves, toque, all the things that they need.
Donations of winter items can be dropped off at the Lethbridge Police Service headquarters. The city of Lethbridge will remove 2 well-known peace shrines in the city's river valley due to environmental concerns. The decision comes as ecologists say various plant species are being threatened along with invasive plants, which are now in the area. Officials say visitors also tend to leave behind trash like plastic and metals, which ecologists say could enter the river and harm the wildlife around it. The shrines also violate a city bylaw despite it standing for several years.
We do want to recognize the effort that went into these shrines. Someone put a lot of effort and passion into these, and these are truly impressive displays. We also recognize that some members of the community may not appreciate the takedown of these shrines. However, as stewards of the land, we have a responsibility to take care of the environment, and after consultation with environmental experts, these shrines pose some environmental concerns that we have. Particularly the damage to several local plant species. There's exposed bare ground, which is leading into opportunity for more invasive weeds to take control of the area. And there's lots of debris being left behind, which is actually poses a risk to local wildlife and could potentially enter the waterways.
Officials say these shrines were made as a sacred gathering space for people of all different faiths and spiritualities, including the local blood tribe, and are made to look like a labyrinth. Removal of the shrines has already begun, with reclamation of the land to immediately follow. Well, up next, the last few elections in Canada and the U.S. have seen accusations of potential election fraud. We speak with a former Alberta MLA who discusses what Canada can do to stop interference in our elections.